Atheism is not a belief, but the mere lack of belief, is what our atheist friends keep telling us. But if that's true, then atheism faces a tough logical hurdle.
Oh, no, it really doesn't. Hi, my name is Tal, and this is Diligence.
If atheism is nothing but the absence of any belief or claim about God, this basically means that to speak of atheism is to describe a psychological condition, namely the condition that the proposition God exists is not to be found in the atheist brain or mind. Psychological states and truth claims are two categorically different things, and one of their key differences is this: only claims have what philosophers call truth value. In plain English, this basically means that claims can be true or false. Psychological states, however, cannot be true or false. Instead, they just are. And so, if an atheist defines him or herself essentially as a person whose psyche doesn't feature the thought God exists, it follows that it is logically impossible for their atheism to be true, because psychological states simply have no business with truth value.
This caricature of what lacking belief means is just laughable. I'd call it intellectually lazy if I didn't think he must have worked really hard to come up with this convoluted way of saying that he doesn't want to hear what we atheists have to say. It's arguments like these that make me wonder if these people actually believe themselves. Lukas, propositions only exist in a metaphorical sense. They are concepts, they are abstracts. And in that metaphorical sense, the proposition God exists is to be found in the atheist's brain just as it is in the theist's. Both atheism and theism are positions regarding this proposition, this claim that God exists. The theistic position is that there is good reason to accept this claim, and the atheistic position is that there is no good reason to accept it. If you want to describe atheism as a psychological state, you can't escape defining theism in the same way. If an atheist is someone whose psychological state is of rejection of the proposition God exists, then a theist is someone whose psychological state is of acceptance of that proposition. If you want to say that psychological states cannot be true, then that holds for the psychological state of believing a proposition just as much as it does for the psychological state of not believing a proposition. And so it's impossible for Christianity and theism to be true also. I actually take no issue with that. To me, it makes more sense not to say sentences like atheism is true or Christianity is true, theism is true, whatever. I prefer to talk about specific claims and whether they're true or not. Was there a conscious creator to the universe? Is there an ultimate moral arbiter? Was there a global flood? And when talking about positions like atheism, theism, Christianity, or whatever, I prefer to talk about whether or not they're founded, they're rational or evidence-based. I also don't think that many other atheists would take issue with this. Atheists don't often say things like atheism is true. This is really wording that I only ever hear from theists. In any case, atheism is no more a psychological state than theism is. And I actually think this is the exact thing that Lukas is trying to hint at. He's trying to say that if they need to prove something, so do we. As I've explained before, I think that theists don't really get what lacking belief actually means in the context of God propositions, though it's completely intuitive to them when talking about pretty much any other topic. But more on that later. Now, let's get to Lukas's weird dilemma. He presents us with two options.
So if you're an atheist and care about logic, here is your dilemma. Option 1. You may continue to define atheism as a psychological state, by virtue of which you logically and conclusively wave goodbye to the possibility that atheism might actually be true. However, you're then entangling yourself in a self-contradiction if you keep making counter-arguments to theistic arguments because of the simple fact that counter-arguments are claims to truth. And how is it consistent for an atheist to make claims to truth when atheism has nothing to do with truth in the first place?
Yeah, you don't get it, Lukas. Atheism is all about truth. Not making an active claim about God's existence is really not the same as not making any claims about anything. Actually, it's almost the exact opposite. If I want to be able to honestly say that I don't accept any claims regarding God's existence, I have to make the claim that these claims about God are not convincing. If you present me with an argument for God, let's say the Kalam, the only way for me to remain unconvinced is to make the claim that your argument should be rejected. The counter-arguments that you complain about are actually the very thing that allows someone to hold this position of lacking belief. The same, of course, is true for the other side. If I present you with the problem of evil, or even something more basic, like the rock so heavy that God can't lift it paradox, and you have no good reason to reject it, then I can see how you can remain honestly unconvinced of God's non-existence.
You're basic. It's a human insult. It's devastating. You're devastated right now.
What you're doing here is kind of a riff on the fallacy, the fallacious idea that proving that an argument is fallacious means that its conclusion is proven false. But you do it in reverse. It seems that you think that if I want to claim that your argument is fallacious, I somehow commit myself to proving that your conclusion is false. It's just really weird. You're basically saying that there's a contradiction in saying your argument doesn't convince me, and here's why. Now, yes, saying I simply lack belief could mean I just don't care, so I never thought about it. And then presenting counter-arguments really doesn't make a lot of sense. And I want to be extra charitable and say that maybe you never thought about what else it could mean. But honestly, if that's the case, that means you are probably not really listening. I simply lack belief could also mean I heard arguments for God's existence and none of them was convincing. This is what most of your interlocutors probably mean. Now, while both these options don't include making the claim that God does not exist, and so don't commit the non-believer to defending that claim, that second option does by definition include the claim that your arguments aren't convincing. So people who mean it in this way, again, probably being every atheist you ever had a discussion with, do need to defend it, which is exactly why they make counter-arguments to your theistic arguments. Let me repeat so you don't miss this really crucial point. They do not make the claim God does not exist, so they do not need to defend that claim. They do make the claim your argument is not convincing, and they do need to defend that claim. They do so by offering counter-arguments. Where's the contradiction here?
The other option is this. Atheists may accept the classical definition of atheism as being an actual claim to truth. That is, the claim that God's existence isn't plausible, or if you want, the denial of the claim that God's existence is plausible. Armed with this definition, atheists face no consistency problem when countering theistic arguments. However, this also means that there is no more running away from the responsibility to offer evidence for their own position.
This is the more common claim, and I suppose the reason Lukas made this video to begin with. It's become somewhat of a thing to say that if atheists want to argue against theistic arguments, they need to present evidence that God doesn't exist. Which is basically, again, this reverse fallacy. Now first, here's something you may not have thought of. Beliefs and positions, whatever they may be, do not carry a burden of proof. I know this sounds weird, so let me reiterate, no belief entails a burden of proof. The agnostic or weak atheist has no burden of proof, and neither does the Gnostic strong atheist. The theist also doesn't have a burden of proof, and neither does the flat earther, by the way. It seems to me that this is always the case. I can't think of any exceptions. No one has a burden of proof, no matter what their beliefs are, until, that is, they want to convince others. When you want to convince others, you adopt a burden of proof. I can be 100% certain that God doesn't exist and have no burden of proof. Lukas could be 100% certain that God does exist and also have no burden of proof. But if Lukas wants to convince me that God does exist, he adopts a burden of proof. What he cannot do is put one on me. Of course, the same is true in reverse. If I want to convince Lukas that God doesn't exist, I'm adopting a burden of proof, and Lukas does not. Now, specifically regarding atheists' burden of proof, I don't have to have a position on God's existence. I can be completely unmoved by either side's arguments, and then it's a question of what the default position is. What do I fall back to? If both sides' arguments couldn't convince me, do I live as though God exists or as though he doesn't? I think that the only reasonable answer here is that we have to live as though he doesn't, because the alternative would lead us to living in endless contradiction. But I'd be more than willing to discuss this idea. Make no mistakes though. Making the case for why it's a reasonable default is really not the same as making the case for why it's true. I can explain why we should believe that God doesn't exist until we're presented with reason to think that it does, without showing that God actually doesn't exist. All of this is especially true when we're dealing with unfalsifiable assertions. You see, normally, revealing a contradiction in an idea counts as strong evidence, sometimes conclusive evidence, of that idea not being true. But theists aren't willing to accept this kind of argumentation. They brush these arguments off with God works in mysterious ways defenses. Sometimes they'd be so kind as to offer their sophisticated guesses for what those mysterious ways might be, but essentially it remains the same. These responses are pretty much just excuses for why the world doesn't seem to match what we'd expect if there is a God like the one that they claim exists. No matter what the atheist will suggest as evidence for God's non-existence, the theist can always contort in some way to avoid acknowledging it. This strategy means that proving that God does not exist is virtually impossible. When the theist side of the discussion makes their claims unfalsifiable, they forfeit the right to ask us to prove that their claims are false. They are the ones who took the option off the table. They are the ones left with the burden of proof. No one else. I think it's probably fair to say that all atheists lack belief in any and all God concepts. We do not believe that any gods exist. Some of us don't feel the need to go any further. They also don't believe that any gods don't exist. They're still atheists because they fall back to the default position of no God. They live their lives, they make their decisions, they judge actions without taking any God concepts into consideration. Others are willing to state that some God concepts are so self-contradictory or nonsensical, or make so little sense in light of reality, that we do actually believe that they don't exist. What we all have in common is that whether or not we see reason to believe that a specific god or gods don't exist, none of us sees good reason to believe that any of them do, and so we accept, at least in a practical sense, that they don't. And from this I think we can derive an atheist claim that nearly all atheists will agree with, and probably many of them will be happy to defend. That non-existence is the appropriate default position regarding the God question, and that we haven't seen any convincing arguments for the existence claim. The second part of this claim cannot really be proven, of course, but it is obviously falsifiable. If someone wants to prove that the atheist claim is false, all they need to do is show strong evidence or a convincing argument for God's existence. And so to defend that part, it's up to us to address every argument and evidence against it. This is precisely why we make counter-arguments to theistic arguments. The first part, I think, feels rather obvious, but if someone were to claim that it isn't, then, as I said, I'd be more than happy to make a case for it. And I think that many atheists feel the same. Unfortunately, we don't really get opportunities to defend the first part. No one on the other side seems to want to touch it. I've hardly ever seen even an acknowledgement of the default position idea by apologists. And the one time that I did see such an acknowledgement, there was no attempt whatsoever to challenge it.
Stop with this null hypothesis. It's enough with the null hypothesis stuff, okay? We've heard that.
All of this doesn't mean that I can't argue for God's non-existence. I could actually make more than a few arguments for this idea, but I generally don't see reason to. Because like I said, and will keep on saying until someone changes my mind, non-existence is always the default position. And so all I need to prove is that Lukas doesn't have good reasons to believe in God. I don't need to provide a single reason to believe that God doesn't exist. Just like I don't need to give a single reason to believe that there was no major scale fraud in the 2020 US elections, or that Bigfoot doesn't exist. Those are the default positions. If someone wants to claim otherwise, they need to present their case. to defend those default positions, all we need to do is address the arguments against them. And all this brings us to the bottom line. If somehow this wasn't clear yet, I believe that the default position is non-existence, and would be more than happy to argue for this point. If anyone thinks that I'm wrong about it, I welcome your challenges. I'm pretty sure that most atheists who present counter-arguments to theistic arguments would also be willing to defend this point, or at least I think that they should be. Lukas, if you want us to be willing to accept the burden of proof, this is the point you have to address. The rest of it is just noise. And of course, while I speak of atheists and atheism in general, the views here are mine and mine alone. I think that they apply to pretty much all atheists, but maybe I'm wrong. If any atheists out there want to challenge the claims that I made here on their behalf, I'm really open to your feedback. As usual, your thoughts and comments are very welcome. There is a comment section down below that's aching for your attention. There are also the like, share and subscribe buttons down there that could do with some gentle touch, so give them some love, why don't you? And of course, in a matter of seconds, you're gonna see a bunch of links to more videos pop up on your screen. If you click them, I'd be really happy with you. Thank you all very much for watching, and remember, our world is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Have a good one.